episode of Reboot Ed podcast. Today I'm without Andrew Schwab. He's otherwise disposed, but we're really excited to have Joshua Davis with us. He's a contributing editor from Wired Magazine and recently had a cover story that really piqued our interest. It's called The Next Steve Jobs. Josh, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I know that your time is limited, and we're gonna jump right into this. You've got an amazing resume, and I've just started reading your stuff over the last couple of months after I saw the article in Wired, and I got to tell you, I love the stuff you're doing. The pieces that you've written and the variety of things that you're doing is incredible. But with respect to the article that you wrote on basically centering on a student in Mexico who went from virtually unknown to the top scoring student on a national assessment in Mexico. How did you come across the story, and what compelled you to write it?
I had written an article in 2005 called La Vida Robot, and the article was about a group of undocumented teenagers who lived in West Phoenix, who grew up in West Phoenix, but they were born in Mexico. And they came together to build an underwater robot as teenagers that went on to win the National Underwater Robotics Championship, beating MIT along the way.
Right.
Yeah, an extraordinary story, a really wonderful story. And as a result of that story, I met a lot of people in the Southwest, one of whom was an engineer at Intel. And this engineer called me up recently and said, "Hey, he had been reading the news in Mexico and saw that this girl, an 11-year-old girl, who lived right on the edge of a garbage dump along the border with the U.S., it turns out was the smartest math student in Mexico." And that kernel of a story, that kernel of an idea, I found fascinating and interesting, and I wanted to find out more about her. And I tried for weeks and weeks and weeks to get through to her, to get through to the school, to get through to the teacher, and I couldn't get through to them. And so finally, I just, I said, okay, maybe I'll give up. Maybe it's too hard, and I don't know. Maybe they don't want to talk. And the idea and the story just stuck with me, and I realized I wasn't gonna be done with it until I actually found out, how the teacher had accomplished this and what his teaching style was. And so I bought myself a plane ticket to Brownsville, Texas, and walked across the border and got in a taxi and found the school and knocked on his classroom door and introduced myself and spent the better part of a week down there.
So tell me, the teacher's name is Sergio Correa, right?
Juarez Correa, correct.
So tell me about him. I gather from the story that he was sort of a frustrated teacher, maybe burnt out a little bit. The system wasn't doing him well, and he kind of saw that there was a need for a change, maybe as much out of the need for his own survival as a teacher. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate. He was doing the traditional style of teaching that he had been instructed in the teaching college he attended, which involved primarily standing in front of a classroom and working through the list of things that the government indicated were necessary to be taught. And
something we in America are very used to, because that's, kind of the way you and I went to school. For sure.
Absolutely. The teaching to the test idea. Right. And a very top-down hierarchical approach to education, where there are, some group of decision makers that say, here are everything that children need to learn, and it trickles down to the teachers. And, in some cases, obviously, there's teachers who have pacing guides where it tells you on any given day what you're supposed to teach. In fact, my wife, in the midst of this, she started out as a teacher. She got her master's in teaching and then taught for 4 or 5 years, and then went into education reform as a lawyer and decided that she missed that experience in the classroom. And so she went back to the classroom just this year as a half-time 8th grade social studies teacher.
Oh, cool.
And as a half-time teacher, I might not get the numbers exactly right, but I believe that she's got something like 70 instructional days, and there's something like 68 topics she has to cover.
Yeah.
So it just feels like, and this is, I think, what Sergio, the teacher in Matamoros, was encountering, this sense that, what am I here for? I'm just a cog in a machine, and A, it's not enjoyable, and B, he didn't feel the students were responding well. There's just this fundamental thing that seems so obvious to me once I heard it. It wasn't necessarily obvious to me beforehand, but obvious that if you're going to learn something, it's harder to learn it if somebody says, learn this here. This is what you need to learn. I'm telling you everything that you need to know. You need to listen to me, write it down, and then when you take a test, you need to spit it back out. Right. That is, for me anyway, and I think for a lot of people, that's a somewhat unnatural way of learning. The way that we more naturally learn is if we're interested in something. If instead of saying, this is what you need to learn, you start from the opposite angle and say, what are you interested in learning? Or you ask an open-ended question like, here's a formula. Why is it true? Or is it true?
Right.
And Sergio, I think, felt that going in, that the way he was teaching was boring to him, and it was boring to the students.
So that led him to basically toss the whole idea, right? What happened with him?
He saw a video that described the work of Sugata Mitra, who is this educational theorist out of India and now Newcastle, England. And Mitra argues that children's innate curiosity should be the building block for education.
Right.
And Mitra's had a bunch of pretty extreme experiments whereby he will leave children with a computer, ask them some open-ended question, and then walk away. That's his instructional philosophy, is fundamentally walk away.
And you talk in your article even, Mitra's actually got some documentation to show that it works fairly well. He walked down to the streets, into the slum close to the school that he was at, pulled some kids off the street and had them take their achievement test, and they scored kind of in the middle of the pack with no instruction.
With no instruction.
And nothing going on.
Sergio was inspired by that, though he didn't agree with it all. But the kernel of the idea being that a child's or anybody's natural curiosity should be the prompt, should be the starting point. That's what he decided he needed to start over with. And what he started to do was he was getting all this on YouTube. I mean, he felt really isolated in Matamoros, but he had a connection. He had an internet connection. It wasn't very fast, but still, it was a connection. And he was able to start pulling these little pieces of information and these ideas from all over the world and assembling them into his own kind of pedagogical idea that would work for his students. And I think that's an important idea. It's not to say that Mitra is right, or this idea is right, or that idea is right. I think each teacher should have the ability to decide what's right for their students. That's the opposite of this top-down hierarchical factory model of education. I think we should devolve a lot of the decision-making to the people who are, the boots on the ground.
Directly in touch with the client, as it were.
Exactly.
Yeah. So sitting in this class is a little unassuming 11-year-old girl named Paloma. And she certainly wasn't the only student in the class that blossomed. I think you reported that the results of the students after working in this model for a while was quite remarkable, pretty much across the class. But Paloma went from absolutely unknown, her father is sick, she's got kind of a tragic story.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about what happened with her and what the outcome of that was.
She she was always good at math, but had never had the room to really demonstrate how good she might be, and nobody had really paid that much attention. partly or largely as a result of Sergio's new style, where he removed the structure, where previously it was like you have to learn this, this, and this, and so Paloma would learn this, this, and this very quickly, but there wasn't the opportunity to go beyond this, this, and this. Mm-hmm. And so when Sergio said, "Hey, wait a second, let's just ask an open-ended question and see where it goes," he would see Paloma take it to places far further than he would have expected. He was very impressed, and so he started ratcheting up the level of questions that he was asking. And there was a moment that I describe in the story where he repeated a story about a famous mathematician back in the 1800s, where this young he was, I think he was probably 10 years old at the time. I'm guessing, I don't know that for sure, but he was in elementary school in Germany, and the teacher wanted to relax. The teacher didn't want to teach, and so the teacher told the class, "Okay, I want you to add up every number between 1 and 100. I think was that right? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah,
right.
No, that's what you described. And I read that, I stopped. I've always fancied myself being fairly good at math, but not that good.
Yeah.
So the thought that a 10-year-old just kind of popped this out of their head was really
So what the teacher thought that it was going to take an hour for the kids to do 100 plus 99 plus 98 plus 97, and within a minute, the German mathematician, the young boy back in the day, had raised his hand and came up with the answer. And so Sergio in Matamoros asked the same question, and again within a minute, Paloma had raised her hand and knew the answer.
Right. Pretty incredible stuff.
And it was then that Sergio knew that he was dealing with a level of intelligence that was off the charts.
But she wasn't the only one in the class that was
correct.
That was
in fact, the whole class, as you point out, the whole class had done very well on the test. There were, I believe it was 10 students who had placed in the top 99% of the country. Absolutely. And even the lowest performing students in the class had done significantly better than they had done in previous years.
So in the course of your spending some time in Matamoros and talking with Paloma and Sergio, did you talk with some of the other kids? And specifically, did you ask them about their experience? How did they like that form of learning as opposed to what they loved it.
They loved it. They said school was fun again. They used to just sit in rows and teachers would talk to them, talk at them, and they didn't feel engaged. And all of the students told me that they now love school, and they didn't want to be sick because they didn't want to miss a day of school.
And this is a school, by the way, that you describe in your article as being, marginal electricity, let alone, having adequate technology resources or even internet access on a regular basis. So these are kids that are fairly isolated from the standpoint of that sort of collaboration or access to the outside world.
Yeah.
It was all through the teacher?
It was essentially the teacher was their conduit to the outside world. What Sergio would do is he would go home, download YouTube videos that he thought would inspire the students, and then he would bring them into the classroom. He would borrow a projector from a friend because the government had given the school a projector sometime in the preceding years, but within a matter of weeks after receiving the projector, thieves had broken into the school and cut the power cord to the projector. They didn't take the projector, they cut the power cord.
So they're looking for the metal.
They wanted the metal.
Yeah.
So almost immediately, the projector that the school had was useless. So Sergio would borrow a projector, and then he would show them these videos of how other students around the world would perform. So there was a student from China who had memorized pi to God knows how many decimal points. There were students from Japan that had extraordinary ability to work in teams. and he would show them these videos and say, this is what you're up against. If you want to, we're not just talking about this classroom. We're not just talking about Matamoros or even North America. I want you to judge yourself and measure yourself against the best in the world. And I think that was an extraordinary feeling for these students who had never actually had the bar set that high for them.
What happens to the kids now? Are other teachers in his school kind of picking up on this? Are they having those conversations, or is
So the teachers at Jose Urbina Lopez Primary School, where Sergio teaches, a number of them are adopting these techniques. Some of them are not. I went and spoke to the head of the regional Department of Education, the guy in charge of teaching instruction, and asked him what he thought about Sergio's success and if that warranted giving the school more resources, maybe a new projector. I would love to. In fact, Wired we're going to get them a projector and bring it down there. Because I asked Sergio, what's the one thing you want? He says, oh, I would love to have a projector. And so I asked the local head of teaching what his point of view about the success was, and he says it has nothing to do with the teacher. These kids are just genetically smart, and look what they did with nothing. So why give them anything more?
Oh, wow. So their bureaucracy, in a lot of ways, is even a little more harsh than the one that I might be used to here in America. Yeah, but the results certainly speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I think Sergio's story is definitely inspiring. I've received, just an overwhelming number of emails from people who have read about Sergio's experiment and feel like they want to try something similar. Teachers from around the world, and it's a testament to the risk he took.
That and you point in your article about a number of places where that stuff is taking place. You mentioned Mitra and what he's done in India, for example, basically just cutting a hole in a wall and sticking a computer behind a chunk of glass, and these kids go from nowhere. Nobody could actually even say what they could demonstrate in terms of academic achievement on some test. He drags them into a classroom after a while and gives them the test, and they score as well as the median students that have been sitting in school all year.
Right.
You talk a little bit about a one-to-one initiative from some guys at MIT, and talk a little more in detail about that. They took some devices to Ethiopia and basically dumped them in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, Nicholas Negroponte, who used to run the MIT Media Lab and now runs one laptop per child. And what he did was he took a number of tablets and, as you say, left them with students in rural Ethiopia and went away, similar to Mitra's pedagogical philosophy. In fact, they didn't even remove the tablets from the box. They just left the boxes there, no instructions, and they came back a number of weeks, if not months later, and the kids had opened the boxes and turned the machines on, and these were tablets, and learned how to read through the alphabet. These were quite young children. They had learned a number of songs in English. So it's quite controversial. The biggest success that Negroponte points to in that experiment was that they had deliberately disabled the
camera.
They deliberately disabled the camera because they didn't want the kids being distracted. That was what I understood the reason for that to be. But of course, the kids they saw that there was a camera and they wanted to use the camera. And so they figured out how to get into the Android operating system and subvert the constraint that the engineers had put on it. And Negroponte is fond of saying that these Ethiopian students learned how to hack Android.
They hacked the tablet and activated the camera.
They did.
Yeah.
And so the reason it's controversial is because Negroponte is implying that we don't need teachers, that all you need is a tablet. You give a kid a tablet and you walk away and they can teach themselves. On the other hand, you look at Sergio's story and it's clear that Sergio was the catalyst for this type of learning, and that without Sergio, this wouldn't have happened. And so I think the import of the story that I wrote is that teachers are absolutely critical in the 21st century. It's just that the way teaching is arranged and the way the entire educational system is arranged has to flip. It has to go from a top-down hierarchical factory model to a much more organic, teacher-driven and student-driven experience.
So as you reflect back, and that's kind of the critical point, I think that educators need to kind of work through and process is, would you say that your view has changed with respect to what teachers do? I mean, the role now becomes not the sole source of information that gets dispensed to the students and they have to somehow assimilate it so they can respond back on a test. What do you think about that? The role is different?
My feelings about the educational system have done a 180 in the last 6 months that I've been working on this story and reporting about Sergio and students. I used to feel that the system, was fine as it was, and maybe we need more instructional hours, and maybe we need more accountability, more testing. That's maybe I think where I was before. And then having investigated it and thought about it and really focused on it and seeing the way innovators like Sergio are teaching, I just realized that in fact the solution isn't more of the same. The solution is to start from first principles, look at the way the world is now,
right,
and create a system that maps to that world. And it seems clear to me that the system that we actually have is a relic of the way the world used to be. And it's understandable that that's how it evolved, but we need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be proactive enough to say we need to reinvent.
And I think I just want to interject. This isn't coming from somebody who's, you're not a professional educator, but you are likewise not an academic slouch. I mean, you went to Stanford.
I did.
So in the old system, you had to have a fairly good record of success. You did okay.
Yeah, I went to a high school that was probably not your typical high school, that gave us a lot of room for experimentation. It was still, we had tests, and I had, the series of classes from calculus to physics and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But at the same time, there were elements of my high school experience where we did things out of doors and we had projects. And it was those things that, when I think back to high school, those are the things that stand out the most for me. And what's interesting about that is, in the existing structure, there you hear people talk about, okay, well, let's be innovative and let's allow students to have a week-long project, which is similar to what happened to me in high school. And yet the thing that I remember most is that week-long project. So why wouldn't we make the entire educational experience that way? If it works so well, why only do it for a week?
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I have 2 kids now. I have 2 young kids, and again, before this reporting process, before I started looking into this deeply, I thought, I want them to have the exact same experience that I did, and follow that trajectory of going to elementary school and middle school and high school. And I've become much more open to the idea of my kids, of pulling them out of school and taking them with me when I go on a reporting trip, for instance, and giving them those experiences of the world that are really the heart of learning.
In a couple sidebars in the article, you also mentioned, I mean, there are models. You mentioned Montessori, and you mentioned a couple others.
Mhm.
I mean, this isn't entirely new sort of territory.
No,
I
there's
think what,
definitely, there's places like Summerhill in England back in the 1920s, I
right,
believe, that
yeah,
created this system where you do whatever you want. And now that mantle has been taken up by the Sudbury Valley school system, the school group here in the U.S. and overseas as well, that is doing a similar sort of deconstructed school, which is very interesting.
um, we we got to get you out of here. I know that your time constraint is pushing this, but would I be safe then to say that your vision would be more like having regular public education teachers step back and do this kind of stuff in general?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm still working through the ideas, and I don't have the answers, but I enjoy brainstorming. What would a school in the 21st century look like? And I think there's a couple of key concepts that I'm interested in thinking more about. One is, why are we breaking kids up into age groups? I think part of the reason is that it's easier to measure them that way, and I don't know that that's a good enough reason. I don't think that's justifiable. I think there's actually something to be said for kids of all ages being put together in a group and learning together.
Yeah.
I think the older kids, well, certainly the younger kids, can be inspired and can learn from the superior skills of the older kids, and the older kids can play a leadership role with the younger kids. And I think that's just natural. I feel like it's almost unnatural to split them up into these very segmented groups. Secondly, I think it's very important for kids to be exposed to new ideas, and that's part of one of the drawbacks to the Negroponte Mitra approach, whereby you leave a child with a computer and walk away. What you're missing there, and what Sergio really did in his classroom in Matamoros, was challenge the kids. I think it's really important to have somebody who challenges you. It's almost like a coach, such that the person comes in and says, well, think about this or think about that, or both in the very specific way of saying, oh, here's a math formula, why is this true, all the way up to, have you considered this occupation or this trajectory through life? And so as a result, I think the school of the future might be broken down into interest groups. So you have a teacher who's really into something, say they're really into math, and they have a room. And then there's the teacher who's really into literature, and that's that teacher's room. And then you have the teacher who's really into video games and programming, and they have a room. And at the beginning of the school year, maybe each child has to go through the school, and they have to spend a day in each room. So you do 5 days, you do 10, you do 2 weeks of that, at the end of which the children have been exposed to all of these different topics, and then they get to choose one that they want to stick with, say, for 4 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever that period of time is. And then they do an 8-week or they do a deep dive into that teacher's subject of interest, and that's exciting.
Into their world, sort of.
In their world, and you get matched up with somebody who is passionate about a subject, which is, I think, important. And you also get to do something that you've chosen, and then after that 8-week period, you go on and you have to take another one, and you go all the way through, and so you actually do get exposed to, say 5 out of the 10 subject areas in a single year. I don't know. I mean, I'm totally making this up. I'm just totally brainstorming. But
the compelling thing is that one of my complaints about education has always been that it's built in silos, and you think about the typical high school experience. You spend 45 minutes to an hour being a literature expert, and then you become a scientist, and then you become a mathematician, but there isn't a whole lot of connection between those sort of topics. They're all completely differentiated.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare when you can, say, dive into a subject and, whatever disciplines are necessary to learn about it have to come into play.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So
maybe I agree with that. I agree that you end up like the version of a school that I just suggested is still very siloized. You still have, each topic, and so maybe there is a time in that 4-week block that two different groups are forced to get together and do a joint project. So you have the math team has to collaborate with the video game team.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm very excited by I love this conversation. I think it's really fun, and I would love to see it. I'd love to see this discussion. I would love to have a lot of people involved in this conversation and figure out what does the ideal school of the future look like.
I've got to put you in our circles because there are a number of folks that are having just these sort of conversations, and I think your input, your vision is really it's spot on in terms of the change that needs to take place. It would be fun to do that more.
Yeah.
Given that, well, maybe we can get you back on, and we'll get some more people into a more of a roundtable discussion. But we can find you, by the way, on joshuadavis.net, and you were telling me about a new venture that you've gotten.
Epicmagazine.com. I'm publishing my own original stories about really extraordinary people in extraordinary places.
Awesome. Now, will that have a technology bent like a lot of your past writing? Or
most of my technology writing will be in Wired, and then my kind of everything outside of that will be on Epic.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Josh, I want to let you go. I know you've got a time constraint, but I can't thank you enough for spending some time talking to us and sharing your experience with the kids in Mexico and a really extraordinary teacher who took a big risk and it paid off greatly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on.
I appreciate that.
Okay,
Take care.
Man. You too. Bye-bye.